Pleasure to be welcoming you all to the Fall 2022 Alberini Family Lecture. Before we get started, Priscilla is going to give a land acknowledgement.
Good evening and welcome to the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art. My name is Priscilla. I'm a history major and I will be graduating in the year of 2025 and currently serving as a visitor service assistant here at the museum. Before we begin tonight's program, we should take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which UC Davis sits for thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kach-el-Dihi, Band of Wintun, Indians of Calusa Indian Community, Kletzel-Dihi, Wintun Nation, and Yocha-Dihi, Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. On behalf of myself and the entire staff of the Manetti Shrem Museum, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Priscilla. So I'm going to get us started. This speaker series is supported through an endowment by the Carlos and Andrea Alberini Family Foundation, which brings renowned innovators and thinkers in design to campus to inspire students and encourage community engagement and learning. We remain profoundly grateful to the Alberini family for its generous endowment of this speaker series, which is central to the intellectual life of our department and its students. We are thrilled to welcome Ahmad Gharbieh to the Manetti Shrem Museum this evening in person and at a great distance from his home in Beirut. Ahmad did actually give me some training on pronunciation of his name, and
You're doing pretty well.
Okay, thank you. That's generous. Ahmad is Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Graphic Design Program at the Department of Architecture and Design, American University of Beirut. His scholarly work in and on critical mapping explores data visualization as a method of studying, representing, and analyzing spatial phenomena, as seen in publications like the book Refugees as City Makers, in which he asks what or who is not being mapped and why. His research concerns include security and militarization, public space, building development, state and sectarian governance, refugeeness, labor, and urban recovery. It's hard to imagine a speaker better able to address design's potential for activism, something to which many of our students aspire. He's a co-founder of Beirut Urban Lab, one of the world's leading projects in critical urbanism, as it investigates the staggering challenges facing Beirut, assisted by the lab's massive and hugely impressive Beirut Built Environment database. The outstanding public importance of the work conducted by Professor Gharbieh and his colleagues is being recognized in its funding, for instance, by the Ford Foundation, the Fondation de France, and the Open Society Foundation. Thanks so much for making it here, Ahmed. Thank you too for those who have worked to make this lecture happen, including the department's events committee, our colleagues at the Manetti Shrem Museum, and the events management of the College of Letters and Science, led by Crystal Masuda. Today's lecture will be followed by a Q&A, to which we warmly invite you. And for those who are here in person, the Q&A will be followed by a reception. We hope you'll stay because it looks like we've got a lot of cheese to eat afterwards, so stick around. Thank you.
All right. Is this okay? Sound-wise? Great. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Simon, for this introduction and for the invitation, and Christina, of course, for helping bring me here. Is this better?
That's much better in terms of volume.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. And also, I would like to give a special thanks to the designer who put this visual material together for the promotion of the talk. I don't know if you're here. If you are,
Maya Marcus.
Well, thank you, Maya, anyway. I also, before I start, want to acknowledge what's happening these days. I've been informed about the labor movement that's been taking place, and I want to say that a lot of the work that you're going to see today would not have been possible without the help of an army of research assistants, graduate assistants, work study student involvement, and also postdoc people. So I just want to begin by saying that, give a shout out to you guys and say that I am in solidarity with you, and to thank you for coming, and to, for those who could not make it, to say that I totally understand if this was due to some kind of, show of support for what's going on. All right, I will begin by introducing the talk, which really focuses on mapping and data visualization projects that we conduct at the Beirut Urban Lab. Central to our work at the Beirut Urban Lab is the instrumental role that mapping and data visualization play in most projects we take on. They are recognized as core components of the research methodology, the vital tools for analyzing and representing urban phenomena. The extension of that is that they also become tools for public engagement, advocacy, and in certain cases, a type of media activism. In this presentation, I will showcase projects that address recent episodic geographies from Lebanon, and more specifically Beirut, and try to situate this work within what is often referred to as critical cartography, while reflecting critically on the politics of data representation. So, a brief overview of the context of Lebanon for those of you who are not familiar with it. So, Lebanon is probably famous for its 15-year civil war that began in 1975 and ended in 1990. After that, there was a huge reconstruction project epitomized by the privatization of Beirut's historic core, led and spearheaded by the Prime Minister at the time, Rafiq Hariri, who was assassinated in 2005, and shortly after that, there was an Israeli invasion in 2006 that took 33 days. It's known as the 33-day war, and this was not the first Israeli military assault on Lebanon. In 2011, the Syrian war happened, and with that came a huge influx of refugees into the country. At some point, there were something like 1.2 million registered refugees in Lebanon. This is the peak of the refugee influx, and of course, these numbers are only the numbers of registered refugees. So, by some accounts, there's probably double that amount in Lebanon. In 2019, an uprising happened in the country due to the beginning of a financial crisis that saw the dual currency system that we had completely fail, which led to the loss of the value of the local currency by 95%. Of course, 2020 saw the pandemic, and in that year, on August 4, a huge explosion in the port of Beirut rocked the city, and I will talk about that in a bit. So the reason why I'm mentioning this sort of like timeline of events is because a lot of the work that you're seeing today is actually quite reactive to these situations that were happening in the country, the position that we like to occupy in the Beirut Urban Lab is to actually always give back to the city. And a lot of that has to do with not necessarily planning projects beforehand, but responding to things that are happening on the ground. Visible security mechanisms in municipal Beirut was one of our first projects. And you'll notice here actually that most of the work that I'm going to show is in fact, can be categorized under the umbrella of public scholarship. Most of this work is printed and made available for the public for free, or it exists in the form of online platforms that are open, accessible, and of course, public as well. So in this work from 2009 and 2010, visible security mechanisms were charted across municipal Beirut, exposing hotspots of militarization and latent lines of demarcation that begin to offer an alternative dissection of the city. Alternative, that is, to the official boundaries that define Beirut's sectors. And what you see over here is pages from a newspaper supplement. So it was printed with a daily newspaper and distributed for free. This is the map, the main map that was produced, whereby we charted all of these security deployments that were, effectively put in place around the city. And as you can see, it's quite, it's quite pervasive. And the visualization approach, sorry, before that, I just want to say that this was in reaction, obviously, to the Hariri assassination of 2005 and the Israeli assault on Lebanon in 2006, which basically gave an excuse for the government to deploy these security apparatus. And after the assassination of Hariri, there were also a series of other assassinations. So a big part of this was also for the protection of the residences of politicians. The visualization approach overlaps two readings of this militarization. First, the physical objects of security themselves, as you can see on the right, including security personnel from the army, the police, and private security, as well as the multiple ways in which the deployment of these mechanisms affects access, mobility, and the general functionality of the city's streets and roads, which is what you see on the left. So as you can see, everything was really charted, all kinds of objects of security at different scale, including military tanks, vehicles, sandbags, barbed wire, and surveillance cameras, and other kinds of tools of control. The design choices here explicitly treat the security mechanisms as play pieces on a board, attesting to the transient nature of these deployments. As we know that elements moved, adapted, appeared, and disappeared as tactics for riot control, while others deployed mainly as site protection for institutions, government buildings, commercial centers, and the private residences of politicians. And one of these institutions are actually the university in which I work, which is an extremely gated space. So these deployments were mostly fixed, but would also increase or decrease in reaction to anticipated threats in times of political tension. After that, there was a period in Lebanon of relative peace, whatever that means actually in our context. And we found ourselves finally being able to talk about things that have to do, less reactive projects, and deciding to tackle some of the issues that were part of the public discourse at that time. Public space was a very important topic. Beirut is notoriously lacking in what we call scripted public spaces, such as parks, promenades, and things of the sort. And there was a huge conversation in the country around that time in 2009, I believe. No, sorry, 2015. What you see over here is another newspaper supplement. So these newspaper supplements were a kind of edited volumes. And we made sure to produce them actually in Arabic so that they can have a very wide readership. And I wanted to include this image. This is me in my old apartment, in my old garden, just to give you a sense of the kind of material object that was put in place at that time with these projects. So I will highlight two contributions to this edited volume. One of them is this one, which was commissioned by the editors, by myself and my co-editors, commissioned to Public Works, which is a small kind of grassroots group of people who also work on similar issues like Beirut Urban Lab. And the other one is the Streets Public, which is the project that we ourselves took on. So one thing that we did is try to illustrate through mapping the history of the practice of public space in Beirut. And what we did over here is actually collect a series of oral histories from people who were old enough to have the advantage of retrospect. And we particularly linked the practice of going out, right, of public space, to the existence of natural sites, sites of nature in the city. So the methodology was really to try to excavate mentions of these spaces from the oral histories and transcribe them onto the map, as you see over here. So you have things like sand dunes, rock formations, the pine forest, the Beirut River, which is now completely dry, and the spaces or the places that themselves were, if you wish, landmark natural spaces for going out were highlighted here in yellow. And of course, we, as you can see, went for a hand-drawn map in this case, as a kind of a throwback to the period and a kind of a natural reaction, if you wish, to the kind of oral history methodology that was put in place. The other project was really about countering this idea that just because there was no scripted public space in the contemporary context of Beirut at the time, it did not mean that there was no practice of public space. And in fact, what we were trying to highlight is that the street itself was probably the most prominent space where public practices, or what we associate usually with public space practices, exist. And there's the multiple components to this project. The first one is inhabiting the street, which is the one that you see over here. And for this project, we opted for a visualization method or a visualization approach that photographically documented all these kinds of practices. So what you see over here is resting, begging, parking, policing, selling, and buying that kind of coexist in the space of the street. And what you see on the left in this diagram is this kind of breakdown between building, pedestrian, and vehicular space that gets renegotiated as these practices actually take effect. So a couple of things here to mention. Clearly, anonymity was very important for a lot of these individuals that were photographically documented, hence this kind of representation. And the other important thing is that the street itself that's being illustrated is not an actual street, but this is a collection of practices that were documented in many different parts of the city, but they were put together in one diagram to give this kind of snapshot of this sort of practice without giving any leeway to geographical identification. So other than inhabiting the street, the other sort of, let's say, the other aspect of the Streets Public project was policing the street. We also noticed that there were a lot of public or people interventions or people's presence within certain parts of the city that sort of question the kind of authority behind the policing of the street as we would imagine it conventionally. This is similarly a kind of a typical square. It's actually it's a particular space in Beirut, but we do without any kind of elements that would give it away. And it has a very similar visualization approach. So it includes people who sort of reside permanently or regularly in that area, They could be a concierge for a building, the driver of a politician that lives in a nearby building, the private security of a bank that's there, the police, and then there's this man who used to basically always sit there next to the park meter and kind of control it. So what we try to do over here is to show these kind of like intricate power dynamics that exist. And it's done mainly through speech analysis. And we expose that by kind of taking snippets of that, of these interviews and integrating them in the diagram. So inhabiting the street, policing the street, and the third was about territorializing the street. For this component of the project, we focused on the Shiyeh Ain al-Ramani area, which is notoriously a kind of an area of conflict during the Civil War, which continues to host communities of both the Christian and the Muslim sects. Hence the kind of historical conflict. And as you can see in this map, the streets that constituted our study area belong to 3 different municipalities in terms of governance. However, once we chart the territorial signs that exist on these streets, and by that I mean everything from flags, posters, stencils, sometimes even speakers that play out music, donation boxes, and so forth. So once we chart that, we realize that there's a clear territorialization that's happening, that's playing out really on the walls of the city. So they include also these kind of like life-size or even larger kind of cutouts of religious and political leaders and so forth. One of the interesting findings in this project, or one of the layers, if you wish, in this project that's also worthy of investigation, is the kind of vernacular language or the different vernacular language that ends up playing out in the different camps, so to speak. So on the one hand, over here, you have your typical, political party, sectarian political party flags, religious figures, political figures. And on the other hand, we have a much more subtle kind of intervention, but it does not make it any more or less, violent, I would say. These series of crosses, I don't know if you can tell from the detail, but this is an actual dagger cross. And it's a sign that that was quite prevalent during the Civil War by one particular Christian right-wing party called the Lebanese Forces. And accompanying this sign on this street or in this example is a line that says "Matbi'a ardak," which translates to "Do not sell your land." Basically, it is a call for the community on the Christian side of this neighborhood to avoid selling property to Muslims, and particularly Shia Muslims. The third project that I'd like to showcase today is refugees as city makers, that Simon just mentioned. And this was really a reaction to not necessarily the influx of refugees to the country, but a reaction to the discourse, basically, that surrounded that influx of refugees. So on the one hand, we had the kind of NGO discourse, which really painted refugees or these individuals as passive recipients of aid with absolutely no agency. And on the other hand, there was the popular discourse, but also the governmental discourse, which, the governmental discourse really criminalized labor in that context through the kafala system. I won't get into that. It's very complicated. And the popular discourse, obviously, was quite racist, as you would imagine. thinking about the influx of refugees as people who are coming to take our jobs, and that kind of typical conversation that I'm pretty sure is not, is not exclusive to the context of Lebanon. In both of these examples, whether it is the NGO example or whether it is the more expected racist example, the language is the language of fear, risk, and crisis. So our objective was really to try to give agency to the presence of these individuals in the country, and hence the title Refugees as City Makers. And we wanted to illustrate that through a number of projects that highlighted their contribution to the making of the city. There were quite a few projects in this book, which is, again, another contributed volume. This time it was produced in 2 languages, in Arabic and in English. It did not take the form of a newspaper supplement, but an actual book. We had the funds for it at that time. But it was also distributed for free and made available to the public in as many events as we could, in fact, give it out. The one project that I would like to focus on investigated strategies of learning and navigating the city among 23 food delivery drivers, 22 of which were Syrian refugees, working in Greater Beirut. The reformation of the neighborhoods of Beirut's neighborhoods was kind of a primary aim, and the excavation of their forms of the neighborhoods necessitated inventive methods of data collection and visualization. The delivery men were asked to name the neighborhoods that make up the city from memory, as well as all the landmarks that they can list within them. Plotting the location of each mentioned landmark, tracing a derived outline around the individual clusters, and overlapping all of the final accounts of neighborhoods on one map allowed for a very particular city to emerge, one that exposes intricate patterns of spatial reasoning and elastic boundary negotiations. Okay, so I will take you a little bit step by step through this process. So every delivery man was asked, as I said, to mention the neighborhoods of Beirut, and I'm showing you now the example of only one neighborhood, which is Hamra in West Beirut. And the landmarks were plotted, as you can see over here. Sometimes they're specific locations, sometimes they're a street. And then we would basically derive this outline around each individual account of the neighborhood. So for one person, this is Hamra. Now, of course, the way that we trace the line around these points is not arbitrary, but it's actually informed by our knowledge of the city and its infrastructure, the mappers' knowledge of the city and its infrastructure. And it's one way of kind of, undermining the objective claims and the neutral claims that usually come with mapping and cartography. It's very important for us to insert our own positionality in our work, and this is one of those examples where we do that. So I'll take you very quickly through the 23 accounts to see how different they are. Until we finally group them together in what we call the collective account of the neighborhood. And in this case, it's Hamra. And this is an example of all of the other neighborhoods that end up sort of overlapping with this one. This is the map of the whole city, which includes all of the plotted landmarks and streets. And in light blue, you can see the kind of individual accounts traced. So the darker the blue, the more delivery men actually consider that part as part of their knowledge of the city. And you can tell that this is an extremely knowledgeable account by only 23 people. It reminds me, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that term, the knowledge in London, UK. Oh, you would probably, which is basically the knowledge of taxi drivers. And we see a kind of a great parallel here with that particular anecdote. So this is how then this map looks as we move towards the collective accounts. And by comparing the result to a map of Beirut's official sectors, which you see over here, we can clearly see the extent of these divergences. The intricacies and elasticities are even more visible on the micro level, where the complexities behind the delivery drivers' collective neighborhood accounts can be probed even further. This is the example of Hamra, again, being kind of investigated a little bit more in detail. So we look at what neighborhoods intersect with it, how the individual accounts work for each person and the individual landmarks, and how the grouped accounts also work. This is another example of Jaitawi. And this one is particularly interesting because East Beirut is considered by many to be almost one neighborhood in our consciousness. We call it Ashrafiyeh. But in fact, for people who know and live in East Beirut, recognizes as multiple neighborhoods, Ashrafiyeh is only actually one of them. So you can tell how the delivery drivers' accounts of the city actually mirror a lot of the accounts of the city's Lebanese inhabitants. And this is basically Ashrafiyeh, and you can see how Jaitawi is kind of cradled within it. Interviews with the delivery drivers revealed that many factors inform their neighborhood configurations, from how safe or dangerous a certain area is to how generous its inhabitants' tipping practices are. Now, the following projects that I will show are all geoportals or GIS-based online platforms. And I have to say, at that time, at that moment in our work, I had a personal, particular resistance to GIS software. I felt that it might actually stifle the design process. As you can see, a lot of these visualization experiments are quite experimental in nature. And I was quite skeptical, and I was wondering whether these kinds of visualization approaches would be at all possible if we move to the kind of pre-configured tools that are made available as GIS software. And I mean, I still stand by that. I still stand by that concern, let's say. But it was important to actually move to GIS technology because the interrogation of such tools and digital platforms was important for the publishing and communication of research findings. So that we can make a wide collection of data sets about the city available to students, designers, academics, researchers, policymakers, activists, and the public at large in an increasingly accessible and navigable visualized form. And I'll talk about at what point that became very clear, the importance of that became very clear. Lebanon is plagued by the scarcity, secrecy, and neglect of data in both its raw and visualized forms. What is important to keep in mind is that, like in many places, something seemingly as straightforward as an open, georeferenced, detailed, and reliable base map is hard to come by, let alone the data sets that might begin to populate it. It is certainly the case in Lebanon that such digital artifacts are precious and can be also urgent, as we will see shortly. The Lebanese state discloses little to no information about its public sector, which is increasingly seen as non-transparent and irredeemably broken amid the current political and financial crisis. And this lack of public data in accessible formats is becoming a kind of hallmark of its corrupt status quo. Worthy of note here is that a national census has not been conducted in Lebanon since 1932. So this is not restricted to data on the built environment. The Beirut Built Environment Database, or BBED, was our first flagship big project aimed at filling some of these gaps, making a dent, let's say, in this prevalent lack of data. It is a public geoportal with multi-sectoral information about the built environment, covering themes of development, housing, public space, public services, and environmental conditions, among others, many of which are fully downloadable as georeferenced datasets. The BBED story began with gaining access to building permits from the Order of Engineers and Architects in Lebanon, covering the period of 1996 to 2018. Now, this was not a georeferenced data set by any means, and it needed to be verified on the ground and supplemented with data collection that can support the many research questions we were interested in exploring. For that, a literal small army of field researchers had to be launched across the city, visiting every building in the list, and creating classificatory systems and collecting a range of complementary information. Beirut is tiny as far as surface area is concerned, which makes it a more manageable geography in that regard. But these efforts confirm what we already know, that often in Lebanon, for data to be had, data must be physically collected. Okay, so I will show you quickly, just keeping track of time, how this database works. So we have an explainer as part of this platform, and it's very important because, again, we realize that these are not necessarily the most accessible or user-friendly types of mapping visualizations or of really interactive platforms for everybody. So it was very important for us to kind of take the users through how to use it, what are the components of the platform, and so forth. This is the part where we explain the different sections of the database. So it really works by showing each layer at a time and talking about it. We were collaborating in this project with an environmental engineer who was really interested in the whole question of the public service and water in particular. So there was an in-depth research about water availability, the presence of water wells across the city, and the quality of water in terms of salinity and the presence of E. coli. It's, you know, there were quite a few alarming findings. I don't know if you know, but E. coli contamination basically is an indicator of the contamination of public service water with sewage water. And it was, I mean, the numbers weren't good. Let's just put it at that. We also included summer versus winter readings, which you can navigate this way, because actually the seasons affect very much the availability of water in Beirut households. So the first one was water purchase. I think this one is water volume, and so forth. The building attributes layer allows you, as you can see over here, I'll just zoom in a little bit, to really look at different aspects that were mapped. From, of course, the base map elements, but also residential and non-residential buildings, high security buildings, missing permits, basically, the kind of flaws in the data, unfinished buildings, high-end developments, number of apartments per project, and I'll turn them on one by one just to see how it works. Commercial ground floor usage, the presence of rooftop solar panels, and so forth. We also had a particular section on vacancy in Beirut. One of our really important findings is realizing how empty the city is, which fed into our housing research, which builds on this idea of the kind of market speculation. We have no vacancy tax in Beirut, so basically owners could buy all sorts of property and just leave them vacant, which has contributed obviously to the elevation of rental and purchase prices. So this is an example of, this is the data, and these are, by the way, only 20 plus years of development, right? So it's only actually a very small portion of the vacancy data. But the objective of this repository of information was beyond mapping for mapping's sake. Representing numbers responsibly is important, as we know that generalized representations can be dangerous. This very telling snapshot of vacancy rates, for example, is as compelling as it can be misleading if not explained properly. It is a limited sample, as I said, and neighborhood aggregations can give a false sense of unyielding boundaries. So in order to avoid these kind of conventionally visually coded maps, which tend to give this sense of generalized information, we try to produce supporting visualizations like this one. So this is a 3D map of the vacant apartments, of the vacant floors of Beirut. So it's kind of like an inverted map, if you wish. And it's another way of avoiding the objective quantitative approach. It is to make efforts to produce visualizations that not only articulate a measure of the territory, but also make a statement about it. In this interpretation of vacancy data, we resort to an inverted mapping of the city, which allows for an alarming image to come through where we see a preview of what a vacant Beirut looks like. Like I said, keep in mind this is only 22 years of Beirut's building development. Beirut's buildings are far emptier than this. Another example which I'm particularly fond of is this interpretation of the water data, which I talked about earlier on. So even though our building sample of these 22 years of building development is limited, it does actually cover a huge surface of the city, which allowed us to use this information in order to project, based on the availability of water, to project this information onto the rest of the city where we don't necessarily have data. And we ended up with this reading. Basically, the darker the color, the more water is available. And this is the difference between the winter map and the summer map. It clearly reflects the lack of competence in managing public services in Beirut, but that's no surprise to anyone, and the environmental inequalities that ensue. But these statements are delicate. They can easily sway into tactics that are close to propaganda. And this is actually where also the danger of maps kind of lies. What I mean by this is that, I don't know if you can notice, maybe some of you who are familiar with the city can realize that this is the infamous green line that separated East and West Beirut during the Civil War. So it's kind of an interesting, coincidence, I would say, that it kind of re-emerged as we projected this water data onto the rest of the city. So it kind of begins to suggest a title for this map. I mean, it's tempting to say things like, I don't know, Christians are monopolizing Beirut's water. Now, of course, this is inaccurate, but it's true of all maps and mapping systems. They impose an alien classificatory order upon the human landscape, and while silently pretending to merely observe and record, they intervene and participate in bringing the landscape into being. The operational efficacy in maps, coupled with the fact that they are generalized, scientific, and seem to present an expert, neutral point of view, instills in them the kind of credibility that allows their assumptions to pass unnoticed. It has been suggested that GIS represented a return to technocratic positivism, and its aesthetics of dispassionate computation further reinforces the blind ethics of accuracy. We also must be aware that accessibility is far from ubiquitous. I'm talking about the whole idea of the geoportal here. That the digital divide consists of a flagrant disparity lag between social groups. These tools need access to the internet, they need bandwidth, and then, of course, there's the question of language. But sometimes urgency should trump these traps. I think I'm a little bit slow. How much more time do I have? Yes? Okay. I'm considering skipping one project, but all right. So, COVID. As I mentioned earlier, in 2019, a series of uprisings started happening in Beirut. Actually, they started happening across the country. It was one of the very few instances where there was a kind of a decentralized sense of collective activism. Then COVID happened, and obviously these restrictions on mobility kind of put an end to all of this. Downtown Beirut during the uprising period was occupied by the demonstrators. Tents by different grassroots organizations set up in downtown Beirut, and obviously as soon as the restrictions on mobility started with the pandemic, the government went down to downtown Beirut and dismantled all of these setups. Also a consequence of the uprisings was a kind of a loss of faith in the sectarian political parties, which are part and parcel, we do not separate them from the kind of governmental powers that exist in the country. At the end of the civil war, the Taif Accord sort of like entrenched the sectarian power sharing political system, which really translated into the different sectarian political parties always being represented in the government. So what happened actually during the COVID period is that these political parties used this opportunity in order to kind of reclaim their presence in different parts of the country. So what we did as again, a reaction to this particular situation is to produce a research called The Territories of the COVID-19 Response in Lebanon. I'm sure you remember it was a period where the online media landscape was just saturated with all kinds of dashboards and things that kind of look like this. and they mainly were giving data on the presence of COVID-19, the extent of the spread, and all this kind of information. So we wanted to kind of disguise our portal as something that looks very similar, but in fact it gives a very different type of information. So we used a research methodology that was mainly based on going through social media accounts of the different political parties, because they really advertised these efforts. And we basically charted them across the country. You can navigate this data by muhafaza, which is a kind of a sector, like a geographical jurisdiction in the country, but also the qada, which is a smaller one. And this gives you an example of how you can navigate this dashboard. And as usual, the restrictions of the kind of design options that you can have within these GIS-generated outputs was quite frustrating, and we decided to kind of go, back to classical, I guess, desktop publishing software in order to do these kinds of visualizations that could be much more intricate, much more detailed, and can show the different layers of this data set behaving in different visualizations. So this particular one focuses on the political parties and their presence across the country. So we had more than one level of reading for this data set. One of them is the actors involved. So we had the political parties, of course, but also political foundations and religious actors, international organizations, government actors, NGOs, INGOs, universities, private sector actors, and grassroots collectives. We also focused on the types of response: aid and relief, medical services, prevention measures, quarantine centers, and so forth. And obviously the kind of quantitative aspect as well. So over here you see the data charted across different scales. Here we focus particularly on the different muhafazas. In this one we focus more on the qada, as you can see. And here we show both the muhafaza and qada comparatively, and we try to give a kind of a reading of the most present type of response that exists. So, as I was saying, that sometimes the limits and the concerns, the critical concerns that exist with GIS technology that I just mentioned, can be trumped in cases of urgency. At no time was the sharing of data more poignant than in the aftermath of the blast on August 4, 2020, when a colossal explosion in Beirut port, killed more than 200 people, injured thousands, and destroyed 1/3 of the city. Until recently, multiple international and local NGOs, syndicates, activists, civil society groups, and state actors involved in damage assessment and recovery of the devastated areas were scrambling to collect, locate, process, consolidate, and analyze spatial data, which were made even more difficult under the COVID-19 related restrictions on mobility. Shortly after the blast, the BBED base map, the Beirut Built Environment Database that I presented just a sec ago, was shared directly with many parties engaged on the ground, including the army, and was made available for download to the larger public. As a unified reference between very different types of actors, it needed to adhere to the most common of cadastral denominators in order to play its interfacing role effectively. So I was really asking myself if I should show you some photos, but here we are. This was the site of the blast, and these are my own personal photographs. I just chose a few to give you a sense of the scale of the destruction that happened. So this is, for example, a store. And this is a building facade that's completely decimated. Heritage buildings were, of course, extremely affected because of their already precarious kind of condition. And this particular image is, in the Jemezi Mar Mkhail area, actually, which is, this is the area where that has been gentrifying for a while. This is where all the kids go and party. This is where all the bars are. And that's kind of how it looked like on the day after the blast. So obviously, when that happened, all of our research projects stopped, and we had to start producing work in reaction to the recovery and to assist in the recovery efforts, other than, of course, sharing the base map and trying to play that sort of like central role. We were interested first at the Urban Lab to kind of be the coordinator of all of these efforts, but for reasons that I really don't have time to get into right now, it wasn't a very effective strategy. So instead, we decided to build the Beirut Urban Observatory, which I'm going to take you through briefly here. It allowed us to ask different questions, such as how did the blast disrupt and/or reinforce ongoing urban trends in Beirut? What geographic and qualitative patterns emerged in the repair effort? How are recovery actors perceiving and reshaping open spaces used by the public in the blast zone? How did the blast impact the economic trajectory of some of the most famous commercial corridors in the city? And 2 years after the blast, which buildings still require repairs and where? So these questions are actually linked to the different outputs that you see here in the observatory. I won't take you through all of them. I don't think we have enough time, but I'll just show you a couple of examples. So this is the mapping of the NGO repairs. I'll start by the individual NGOs, and you can tell, this is not, by the way, all of the NGOs. These are just the NGOs that we managed to get information from. And I'll just scroll over here for you to get an idea of how many they are. And also, by the way, some of these buildings have overlapping NGOs, and this is one of the limits of GIS, for example, right? It doesn't really allow you to visually code things in a way where you can, on the building level, show more than one actor actually intervening in one space. One way of doing it would be to perhaps do a 3D map where we can then actually start coding things by floor. Anyway, so there are possibilities, but as you can tell, this kind of visualization language, this kind of mapping language is much more conventional in nature. This is, however, a very interesting reading of the same data set where you can see that there's a complete lack of coordination, There's a complete lack of coordination between these different groups. So this is the scale of how many NGOs were involved per building. And you can tell that in a lot of cases, 4 to 11 different organizations were conducting repair in one particular building. Actually, through our research, we know that there were sometimes examples of 4 or 5 NGOs that were involved in the repair of one apartment. So this lack of coordination resulted in, unsurprisingly, different modalities of repair that weren't particularly successful on the macro scale. So we decided, in order to illustrate that, to include another output on the observatory, where we basically, through observation, record instances of broken glass. We call it the broken glass survey. It's a little bit of a riff on the broken window idea, but obviously this is not like at all within criminology. But it is nevertheless a very simple method and very effective way of trying to see exactly the extent, of repair. And everything that's in pink, I guess, is instances where broken glass was very visibly recorded, very visibly observed and then recorded on the map. And the map also allows us to click on each instance and see the photographic evidence of these broken glass instances. So the first geoportal that I showed, the BBED, we kind of refer to as the repository. This one we refer to as the monitor. And it's important when we create these different geoportals to try to understand, to try to position each one according to its own objectives. And there was, of course, the COVID-19 dashboard, which was a little bit of a one-off. I mean, we really did it out of, we were observing something happening on the ground, and we wanted to very quickly kind of make a statement about it. But the fourth geoportal that I'm going to show you now, I like to describe really as a manifesto of sorts. Precarious Lives is a post-blast project which allowed us to focus particularly on housing uncertainties in Beirut. So I call it a manifesto because what it does really is try to advocate for a very particular, it tries to advocate for the concept of precarity to replace concepts such as vulnerability or poverty in order to, in fact, really be able to understand the intricacies that exist in the, situations that a lot of the residents of Beirut were facing, and a lot of the dangerous outlooks really that they were anticipating. Precarity is particularly entangled with a development frenzy, itself fueled by an economic model built on the principle of commodifying land. Precarity also results from the lingering remnants of modern planning, where ambitious projects materialized into delayed eviction and partially executed physical interventions. It further materializes in zones of exception, areas temporarily allocated or conceded to dwellers deliberately forced into derelict living conditions to preempt them from making claims to consolidate a future. Finally, precarity is the outcome of forms of governance that criminalize the presence and labor of many and facilitate the displacement of populations deemed undesirable to the interest of capital. All right, let's navigate this again quickly. So this really works by, first of all, of course, it gives a theoretical framework. It's a kind of a piece in digital humanities, I would say. But it allows us to, first of all, introduce like a citywide reading of precarity with 4 different layers. The first is what we call precarious neighborhoods, and these include Palestinian refugee camps, urban informal settlements, neighborhoods developed as permanent refugee housing, and the second is the buildings demolished and or threatened with demolition, and this data actually comes from BBED. It's one of those examples where there's a kind of a conversation across our different platforms. So the 138 buildings that were surveyed as part of the BBED platform. The third was the planned road projects that were on hold. Which you can see over here. And you can navigate each one on its own and get a little bit of information about it. And the fourth, obviously, were the buildings affected by the Beirut port blast. And what you see in this particular visualization is an overlap of two surveys, one that was done by the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture, and the other one that was done by the Order of Engineers and Architects. So these are basically the 4 layers of precarity citywide that we identified. And then based on that, we identified particular clusters which we wanted to study a little bit more in detail. Here you see the compounded layers together. And on top of that, these circles are, they represent the different clusters that we wanted to kind of go a little bit more in depth with. And I'll show you only one example and how it works. This is a kind of an overview of the different clusters, and it kind of takes you across the map just to show you where each one is located. I'll just stop here for 1 second because, you know, there's a lot of credit to be given to all of the team. And yeah, I mean, I never do them justice enough. And you can learn about each case on its own. So over here, you can really navigate each of the clusters that we did so far. I don't know if you've noticed, but there were like yellow circles, but there were also blue squares. The yellow circles are clusters which we identified, but not necessarily went on the ground to investigate yet. And all of the blue squares are the ones that you kind of like see over here. I'll show you one cluster just to kind of explain how it works within the GeoPortal. So we use a lot of archival documents, photographic documentation, residence testimonials, and so forth in order to give a narrative for each particular housing cluster. So there's an overview, some testimonials, as I mentioned, photographs that show the state of the damage. We use old maps with the kind of precarity citywide map that we've developed to accompany a timeline, a kind of a history of the neighborhood, which of course leads all the way to the post-blast 2020 reading. And then through that, you can go back to navigating any of the other clusters. Okay. This is our recent 5th GeoPortal that I'm talking about today, and I'll be very brief and I'll conclude with this one. As I mentioned, after the Lebanese lira lost 95% of its value, the housing market became a very difficult thing to study and a very difficult thing to gauge. If any of these maps I can position, you know, I can label as a counter map, it would be this one. This is a user-fed platform that allows the tenants of Beirut to be able to input how much they're paying for their apartments as renters, and what do they get with that, right? I mean, again, there's a lot of context for me to give you here. So there is no government electricity being provided in Lebanon anymore. I think we get something between 1 to 2 hours. So everything is basically based on private generators, which is clearly linked to the price of fuel, which is clearly pegged to the dollar. And most of us actually these days pay much more for the private generator than we do for our rent. So we needed to understand how much people are paying, what they're getting with what they're paying, how much electricity they're getting, how much they're paying for that electricity. So the quantification of the electricity is also kind of quite complex because it's not only about how many hours you get per day, but also the amperage, is that correct in English? Okay. So while there is no information out there except for the asking prices that are made available, I guess, through real estate websites and other kinds of information, people did not know how much they are how much they are supposed to be paying, where, right? When they're trying to rent a place and for what, depending on the size of the apartment and the amenities that come with it. So in order to try to start providing the public with this kind of information, we built this platform called City of Tenants that allows the users to enter this information by taking a very simple survey. The way that it works is that you go to your building. Let's say I live here. And you take the survey, which includes a lot of information about how long the person was living there, how much they pay in dollar and in Lebanese. And when we move on, obviously, we get into the survey, we get all kinds of information about amenities, electricity, the presence of a concierge, and the number of people per household, the surface area of the building, of course, presence of balcony, terrace, outdoor space, and all this kind of information. So this, for us, really is the counter map of today. And so far, we have only 1,600 entries. User-fed platforms are notoriously difficult to actually encourage, right? So a lot of times we end up doing the surveys ourselves. We really go and visit apartments and kind of fill the surveys ourselves for them. We're trying to, this hasn't yet been, it's public, but it hasn't yet been promoted. We are tweaking some parts of it at this point before we actually kind of go on an all-out campaign to encourage the public and the renter community of Beirut to, partake in this experiment. Okay, I will conclude. Underpinning all of this that I showed you today is an interest in exposing and subverting the institutional power and political bias embedded in maps and inherent to historical, cartographic, and map-making traditions, as well as advancing knowledge production about urban conditions in the Beirut, Lebanon context and promoting a socially aware design practice, and an approach to urban research that strives for healthier, more equitable, more viable, and ultimately more just cities. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Ahmad, for that incredible talk. I really appreciate I'll use the word layers, but it's not just through GIS, but the hand-drawn, the GIS, the photography, the data, the ways in which these are such rich projects in a service to public humanities. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We wanted to open it up for questions. Simon has questions perhaps from the chat, from live stream, but I'd like to start with folks who are here in the room, especially students. If you have any questions you would like to ask Ahmad, I will bring the mic to you. Yes.
Hi, I really like your speech, and I really appreciate how you use graphic visualization to tell your story. And I take a GIS class in summer, and we are taught to how to use ArcGIS Pros, like based on some data or information to tell your own story, and I really like that. And your speech are really amazing. So, and I take a look at your urban plan website, and I see like you guys are engage multiple public to like let them know what you guys are doing. So I am curious about like will you guys select more like local people, let them to engage your project, have some public speaking in open space, and let more local people to know what you are doing and or like engage in your project?
Yes. So I'm one of 4 members in the Beirut Urban Lab, main members in the Beirut Urban Lab, and I lead the critical mapping and data visualization unit, let's say. But my colleagues actually, some of my colleagues work a lot on community engagement. One of the projects that we embarked on after the Beirut blast focused on one particularly historically neglected area in Beirut called Karantina, where a kind of recovery strategy was put in place that was done very much in coordination with the community of Karantina. So it's been actually 2 years, and just very recently, I think you can check that out on our website, the strategic recovery plan that was very people-centered, a people-centered approach to recovery. Just recently, the strategy was published, and that involved a lot of community meetings, visits to the site, and the engagement of multiple actors on the ground. Sometimes when it comes to public speaking events, they happen. I mean, the lab. I don't particularly partake in that myself, but the lab does for sure, and they often are in relationship to certain situations that arise, such as the 2019 uprising. So the lab actually had a presence on the street, and specifically when it came to the housing question, which, as you could tell in this presentation, is a kind of a very important research track in what we do.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Divya, and I'm a design major here. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time and energy to kind of share these projects.
My pleasure.
I also empathize with how emotional sharing these projects might be, as they were all responses to these like very historical and tragic events. I don't have too much familiarity with GIS technology and tools, but I found it really kind of interesting and insightful, the kind of hesitation and concerns you had of modern GIS tools and how they kind of disrupt the design process. And I think a lot of people would think that modern tools are supposed to be enhancing and pushing us forward. And I've liked the example that you brought up of showing how many NGOs per building or were working on each building was such a simple kind of like piece of information that should have been easy. And your solution to that, instead of like creating their more intricate 3D map, was to just create another map. Yeah. where you said like how many NGOs were per building. And I think that that's extremely insightful in the strategy that's necessary in creating these tools, because we need them to be accessible to people. We need them to be readable. We need them to be easy for anybody to just kind of like look up and understand in seconds. Otherwise, they're going to just drop it, and all the work is to waste. So I found that really insightful in just showing like how important design thinking is and user-centric thinking is. And just thank you for going in depth of those details and showing the hardship of design and what actually, the skill that's necessary. And I wanted to ask if you had any more examples that were similar to that, or any more kind of like insights of that kind of hesitation of modern tools, and maybe what you think is missing from those modern tools and why they're disrupting the design process, and kind of inspire like taking that step back and going back to kind of hand-drawn maps in terms of accessibility and readability.
There's actually plenty of examples. I don't know if any are going to readily come to mind right now, but I always have these arguments with my team. The younger ones tend to be advocates of these tools. I'll tell you a little secret. I'm actually also not very skilled in GIS. I know how it works, and I thankfully am able to kind of work with a team of GIS enthusiasts who like to crack a lot of these problems. And yeah, often more than not, we do find some kind of solution for some of these challenges that we face. So two things that I would say. One is what you've mentioned, is that often I don't like the term solution here, but often the strategy could be to not adhere or be too preoccupied with this idea of an all-telling single map, right? And this is also something that comes with the kind of history of cartography, where maps are celebrated as these untouchable, finite kind of pieces of representation. So what you said actually was very true. So the moment that a lot of times we find ourselves saying, let's not create a map, let's create a map set. And that allows you to actually have multiple visualizations that could be in conversation and that could build upon one another, respond to one another, complement one another. So this was number one. Number two is, I'm sure these technologies are developing. We also particularly use Esri's ArcGIS. If any of you are familiar with this software, it's quite an institutional kind of product, not open source, very expensive. But we just happen to have a license through the university where I work. It wouldn't have been my choice. Obviously, the whole politics of software is a very important thing to talk about here. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room to discuss all of these things. But I think some other open source software are much more visualization sensitive. Mapbox is one of those. Even though most of these platforms actually still suffer from kind of the main issues that have always existed within cartographic convention. I'll give you one example. One of the main sort of critiques, or the kind of the poster child of this idea of maps being necessarily wrong, and they impose a kind of a geometry which is, definitely not neutral, but tries to pass itself as such, is the notion of the geometric projection, right? Historically, the Mercator projection, which we see everywhere in our geography books, to, the map behind the news anchor on TV, privileges the north, puts Europe in the center, and so forth. So one would imagine that these kinds of open source software that have obviously very admirable aims still use the Mercator projection. Actually, there's something called the web Mercator, which all of these platforms still continues to use, including OpenStreetMap, right? Which is the platform of user-fed geographical data information. And I did have one last thing to say. Yeah, the other thing is, let's not be afraid of going back to drawing. Honestly, all of this is fine and dandy, but yeah, I showed you, and the COVID example was great. It wasn't hand-drawn, of course, but we went back to the tools that we know very well, where we can draw our little icons and size them as we wish and put them where we want on the page, and really, do what graphic designers like to do.
We have time
Thank you for
for
your question.
one more question. Yes, here, okay.
Hi, my name is Sophia. Man, only one more question. Okay. Basically, obviously, you and like the team in general, we're going to face many obstacles as you continue with this project, as it developed, as it changed. And I would like to ask, as an aspiring designer, I am majoring in design here at UC Davis. What were some maybe mindsets or perspectives that you had to continue, you or maybe the team as a group or maybe individual members that come to mind? What were some concepts that you guys had to kind of affirm to yourselves constantly when you were met with these obstacles in order to overcome them? Because design is as logical, as driven by data as design is, it's also very emotional. Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk about that with you, or for you to just bring it up here right now.
Are you particularly referring to the kind of design challenges that I mentioned throughout the talk, or in general? Okay, I'd go back then to a point that I made earlier, which is really about inserting the subjectivity and positionality of the mapper in the work. I think this is really crucial in order to not think about your emotional, relationship to these topics or these, in these cases, these traumas, as something that needs to be put on the side as you embark on trying to make sense out of these situations. It's key to recognize that these are not stifling, aspects of the work, but rather productive aspects of the work. On the one hand, it allows for insight to come through, and on the other hand, it really allows to challenge these kind of assumptions that are usually embedded in charts, maps, diagrams, and other kinds of supposedly, value-free representations. So, yeah, the short answer is embrace it. It sometimes could be triggering. I said that already, but I really, really put these images in and then took them out and then put them in. And then I realized that I had to think about my audience as well. So I ended up doing that. But I hope that answers your question.
All right, well, we are out of time. Really valuable to have you here and have your words. There is a reception right outside, so please hang around, spend some time, eat some cheese and crackers, and continue conversing with Ahmad and with each other out in the lobby after this lecture. So thank you so much again to the Alberini family and to all of you for being here today.
Thanks for coming.